On this episode of New Mexico Now, we will discuss President Trump and how his actions may impact the borderland. Also, the New Mexico legislative session is underway, and we will discuss lawmakers' proposals to tackle the budget crisis in our state. This is New Mexico Now. Hello and welcome to New Mexico Now. I'm Anthony Moreno. Joining us today is Walt Rubel with the Las Cruces Sun News and Lauren Villagrán from the Albuquerque Journal. Let's get started. President Trump this week signed an executive order withdrawing from the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump campaigned against the deal. The president has made well known his opposition towards NAFTA as well, and his plans to renegotiate that trade deal, as he's called it, the worst trade deal ever in the past. Also on the campaign trail, the president has made clear his plans to build a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. And of course, there are plenty of questions regarding what's going to happen to DACA recipients. Let's get started in this. President Trump talked about his plans to speak with the president of Mexico and the prime minister of Canada to renegotiate NAFTA. Lauren, I know you cover the border region. There's obviously some concern, I would think, from folks in the industrial zone there.
Yeah, well, I think we're still in a moment where there's more uncertainty than certainty about what a renegotiation means. The government of Mexico just said this week that they are willing to look at a renegotiation as long as their sovereignty is respected. I'm not sure what that means in the current context, but I do know that the other two details they pointed out is that they want Mexican migrants respected as well as their wages. Remittances are a huge economic driver in Mexico. I think it represents something like $25 billion annually, and Trump has said that for Mexico to pay for the wall, that could come out of remittances. That could be devastating for Mexico.
And one of the other things that President Trump brought up was the possibility of a border tax for companies that decide to leave the United States. And that actually drew some perspective from Jerry Pacheco, president of the Border Industrial Association, who wrote in the Albuquerque Journal in a recent column that slapping a tariff on these companies that move across the border isn't going to bring back manufacturing jobs to places like Ohio and Michigan. He says that due to cheaper labor in other countries and the low unionization that the countries have, that these jobs are not going to come back. I'm wondering, is this really the new reality that we're looking at right now as far as these words go?
I would just echo kind of what Lauren said, is that right now, like so many other issues, we're kind of in a wait and see mode with this president. We know what he's against. We're not sure yet what he's for. And Lauren's also right that this negotiation is not going to be a one-way negotiation. I mean, Mexico will end Canada, but I think honestly Canada is trying to sort of keep as much distance from this as they can. They see the new president training all of his fire southward, and I think that's fine for them up north. But for the people in Santa Teresa and for what is really the one bright spot in terms of economic development in this state, that if all of a sudden tariffs were put in place overnight without anything else to soften that would just bring all of that to a crashing halt immediately, all of that development that's taking place down there.
Well, I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind, when you look at the $500 billion in trade that the U.S. does with Mexico every year, it's not just goods from Mexico being exported here one time or goods from the U.S. being exported to Mexico. 40% of the content of anything that Mexico exports to the U.S. on average is U.S.-made product. So there is nothing that Mexico sends our way that we haven't included inputs in. So when you talk about slapping tariffs on that stuff, well, what does that mean? And particularly for our region, Santa Teresa is based on, they do have manufacturing down there, but it's a lot of logistic services. It's all that stuff crossing back and forth. For example, the wind blades that are produced in Juarez, there's a trucking company out of Santa Teresa that moves the molds over. They move the wind blades back. They move product south, the composites. So it's a constant back and forth. It's not just this one way or one time kind of thing. So all of that will have to be taken into account.
Well, it seems like the president along the campaign trail, when he talked about trade, it was in black and white terms, but is trade really a gray issue?
Well, I don't know if I would say it's a gray issue. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah.
It's not something that can be unwound overnight. You're talking about billions of dollars in trade. You're talking about, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of different types of goods. And it's not just about labor. Mexico itself, apart from NAFTA, has an incredible number of trade deals around the world, which is why a lot of US companies like to manufacture in Mexico, because they can get those tariff-free exports from Mexico to other parts of the world. So everything is interconnected, and it's not this kind of A-B situation. It's the whole alphabet, if I'm explaining myself.
The other thing that I think goes missing too much in the discussion, especially in the Midwest, where they have been decimated, their industrial area has, but that is the result more of automation than it is of trade. And this idea that if we could just end these trade deals, all of those manufacturing jobs would come back, that's just not the case.
One of the other things I want to move on to that we were talking about is that President Trump spoke adamantly on the campaign trail about building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Already, there's already wall or fences coming up with newer technology and things like that. I mean, what's the real reality that something like that can really happen? I know that he's already met with Customs and Border Patrol chiefs who said, we need 21st century technology, we need smart fences, not really a wall.
Right.
I think he has. I don't know if President Trump has specifically scaled back that promise at all yet, but I think the reality on the ground is that you are talking about a fence. You aren't talking about the Great Wall of China. And when I speak to the Border Patrol, they're not really willing to go on the record with the press about this, but they don't want an opaque wall. They want to be able to see what's happening. They want to see what the threat is if and when there is a threat. So yeah, the 21st century technology is important. I believe CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, has identified about 400 miles of the border where they believe fencing could be built. You are always going to run into the issue that there are parts of the border, including in New Mexico, that are not easily fenced. They have the natural barrier, these incredibly rugged mountains. And I think I saw the statistic, and I hope I'm quoting this right, but a mile of fencing is about $3 to $4 million on the border on flat, regular ground. When you look at some of those more rugged areas, it can go up to 10 million a mile. So where is the money going to come from? Is that the best way the money is spent? And I think CBP would say, we need cameras, we need agents, we need that technology.
One of the other things that President Trump, talked about with the border, and obviously there are a lot of questions dealing with that, was what's going to happen to the DACA recipients here in our country? They're kind of up in limbo right now.
They are, and he won't at this point, or his spokesman won't at this point, even go so far as to saying that those people who took that step and came out of the shadows and registered will be protected. At some point, I think they have to get there. I mean, the United States government told these people, trust us, and so to turn around and to use those registries now against those people, I think would just be unconscionable. And I don't think the public would stand for that. But that gets beyond the bigger issue in terms of what does he eventually want to settle on. I don't know, and I don't think he knows.
The so-called dreamers, there's only about 750,000 recipients in the U.S. When you look at the whole undocumented population of 11 to 12 million people, I think the larger question really is what's going to happen to all of those people. In New Mexico, there are about, I think it's a few more than 10,000 DACA recipients. So they and their families are going to be watching it closely.
Well, I mean, we'll be watching it closely as well as things unfold. But we have to move on now. As we all know, the 60-day legislative session is underway in New Mexico, and the state is trying to figure out what it's going to do to address the budget shortfall. Now, this week, as we're taping this show, the New Mexico House of Representatives has passed some legislation to address that with a package of budget solvency bills that are aimed to fix a deficit for the current fiscal year, that is, and help the state's general fund reserves as well. The House approved a pair of bills that would reduce funding to school districts by 2%, transfer cash balances from various state accounts to the general fund, and reduce agency spending. The Senate has approved something similar, but as I said, we're taping this program this week, so there should be a deal, we would think, here pretty soon.
Yeah, that's the easy part. And what you're talking about is plugging the hole in the current fiscal year budget. And going into the session, the plan was that the House was going to take on that first, while the Senate takes on the next year's fiscal year budget. And so you're right. I mean, I think there was an agreement pretty much coming into the session as to how they would plug that $69 million in this year's budget. It's disappointing to me because I think they're sending a real bad message to the school districts when they are essentially punishing those districts that did a good job of saving over the years and building up their reserves. So now they're going in and they're sweeping those reserves. The districts that didn't do such a good job saving money will be protected. And I just think that sends a very bad message to the local school boards and the local school superintendents who have been doing the right things over the years and now are going to get whacked for it.
I mean, you brought up that message. I mean, from their perspective, the local school districts, especially the ones that have been doing a diligent job of saving and preparing the reserves for days like this, I mean, there's really not a great choice at all for them.
No, there isn't, and that's why it's so hard to be overly critical, because if you're not taking from schools, then you're taking from healthcare, or you're taking from economic development, or you're taking from higher education. This will be the third year when they've gone in needing to cut immediately. The first 2 years they've done that all with cuts, no revenue increases at all. The governor is bound to determine that they will do that again this year, and that I think is the big question as we go into we're just in the first week really of the session now.
Well, you mentioned that they obviously have to get a deal done with the governor. Where are lawmakers discussing what could be a possible give and take to meet even keel with the governor and close a deal?
Well, the governor has proposed a lot of things, including reducing the take-home pay for state workers and for teachers. Now, she wouldn't reduce the salary, but she would make them increase more into their pension.
Out of their own pocket.
Right. So it has the same effect of reducing their take-home pay. I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to that in the legislature. To me, the interesting thing is going to be, will they be able to agree on anything that will increase revenue, whether that comes through taxes or fees or some other way. There will be a lot of things introduced. The governor has said that she's open to tax reform, but I think she means that as a revenue neutral tax reform and not increasing revenue. So I think that's where the big fight's going to be.
Well, the governor brought that up in her State of the State address, and also eliminating, quote, loopholes. I'm curious, what are the loopholes that she wants to, eliminate, and also are there enough loopholes to really bring some money to address the current financial situation?
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure what the answer to your first question and the answer to your second question is. I think no. I mean, I think, like I said, this will be the third year that we've tried to do this by sweeping existing money and by cutting agencies and by cutting education and by cutting, higher ed, and to the point where we're not even able to provide help for veterans homeless services here in Las Cruces. Things like that end up getting cut. And so I don't know. I know that the governor believes very strongly that any kind of increase in taxes would be a drain on job growth, which I don't think is going great anyway, but that's what she believes, and she is very determined that that's not going to happen.
Speaking of job growth, I'm curious, are the LEDA funds used for economic development in play as a possible deal with the governor?
I don't think that's a heck of a lot of money at the end
It's
of the
not.
day. What is it?
Well, I don't know, but you're right. I mean, in terms of what they're needing, it's not. But it's both LIDA, which is essentially the closing fund. You need to give this company X amount of dollars to close the deal. I mean, that's what LIDA is. And we had a story in the paper just today about a new farming operation that took advantage of those funds, and they're going to expand and provide a lot of new jobs, and that's going to be great for our community. It's LIDA and JTIP, which is the job training program. Those are the two things that the governor has really relied on heavily as part of her economic development plan, and she has made it very clear that she will fight to save those as well. But they are on the chopping block as far as the legislature is concerned in their budget.
And those have always been difficult for southern New Mexico, have they not? Because they're tied to workers living in New Mexico.
That's right.
And we draw so much of our labor from West El Paso. When you look at a market of 800,000 people, part of the reason why we can get big companies down here is because we have access to that labor market. So when you live over the state line, especially because they don't have a state income tax, although property taxes are higher over there, I think it's always been a challenge to get those additional kind of state closing fund and LIDA money.
Well, what about the possibility of addressing tax reform in New Mexico? I know, Walt, you wrote a column earlier this month about a possible bipartisan solution with lawmakers.
Yeah, Jeff Steinborn is working with Jason Harper, a Republican from Rio Rancho, on a bill that at one time would have included bringing back the tax on food, which was taken away in the Bill Richardson administration. That's off the table now. They're no longer looking at that. Once again, what they're trying to do in that bill is not to increase revenue. They're looking at something that would be revenue neutral. But their intent is to get rid of all of these exemptions that we have in the tax code now that are just, it seems like every year they pass another 8, 9, or 10 special exemptions for this particular industry or this particular business, and they never go away. And so after years of doing that, the analogy that I hear all the time is that our tax code begins to look like Swiss cheese, because it has all of these holes in it that have been carved out for this special interest or that. And so they're trying to find out a way to get rid of those, to broaden and flatten the tax base, and to make it a little bit more fair and a little bit less reliant on the gross receipts tax, which is a regressive tax, and it's different than every other state, which has a normal sales tax. The GRT was designed to enable us to get federal revenue as well from all the Army bases and military bases and labs and things like that, so that we can capture that money as well. But it's a very unique and a regressive tax that they're trying to figure out a way that they can broaden that out.
Well, speaking of making things fair, I mean, is there any talk about, I know this has been brought up before, about the possibility of, making things fair for the local small businesses by bringing an internet tax for people that are purchasing things online?
Well, that's a federal government. Right now, the states aren't allowed to do that by federal law. And so I know there has been legislation introduced, I don't think it's ever been passed, that New Mexico would at least start working on getting everything in order so that if the federal government ever did reverse that, they would be ready to go and impose that tax.
You know, one of the other things that I know was brought up in the last session was the possibility of a bill that would push to sell the spaceport. Obviously, the state keeps pumping money into the spaceport. We're looking at ways to cut money across the board. I'm curious, is there anything, are you hearing any chatter about that right now? Is anybody willing talking about that? And is it a risk to continue to pump money into the spaceport when it's not really bringing revenue back in?
I don't know what's in the legislature currently with respect to the spaceport. I know the spaceport director, the new spaceport director, and the administration there believes that they're going to be self-sufficient in a year or two financially. It's a difficult space. no pun intended, the commercial space industry just isn't materializing with the speed that anyone in the whole country thought. So while the spaceport does have some sort of structural financial issues, the commercial side, it's just not going to be there as quickly as anyone expected. So it's a good question and a tough one that legislators are going to continue to have to look at.
I don't see any efforts to try to sell it. I mean, I don't think that ever was a serious proposal. That was something that Senator Munoz from Gallup put in. And Senator Cotter from Las Cruces had been a supporter of that and a critic of the spaceport, and he lost in the last election, and so that takes away one of the fiercest critics in the legislature. But I think Lauren is right. I think their challenge is getting and they don't need a lot, but they need a little bit of money here for the next couple of years just to get them to the point where they will be self-sufficient. And that, just getting a little bit, I think, is going to be a tough fight this year.
Well, I'm curious, the spaceport obviously was built years ago in a different time. Now there are spaceports in other communities, larger communities, and future ones coming up. I mean, is it going to be really tough for commercial space to really thrive here in New Mexico if and when that happens, now that there is so much more competition?
Well, I think that the answer to that question all depends on Virgin Galactic. Yeah. Virgin Galactic is the tenant at Spaceport, and Spaceport does have plans to kind of open up land for different companies to come in, but that beautiful facility, that iconic terminal, is essentially leased exclusively to Virgin. So if and when Virgin begins flying, and they're currently in a testing phase, the answer to your question is no, it won't be a problem at all, because we'll have one of the top commercial spaceflight companies located here. That being said, 2 years ago, Virgin had that fatal, tragic accident during rocket-powered testing, and they have not yet begun rocket-powered testing again. I think they're moving very close to that phase, but that's the dangerous phase. That's the difficult phase that all space companies are really working towards. SpaceX as well has had some issues with their rocket testing. So
the other thing I would say, just in terms of competition with other spaceports, is I do think we do have some advantages in terms of we have the unrestricted space above the spaceport, which is a huge advantage. And that is because of White Sands Missile Range that we have that. And we also have things like the missile range and NASA that are nearby that I know Dan Hicks is trying very hard to build synergies with those. So there are some things going for it that other spaceports don't have.
All right, well, we'll see how things unfold. Also, I want to get into some other things that we could see with this legislative session and the possibility of certain constitutional amendments. Yeah. One regarding recreational use of marijuana, and will we see something regarding minimum wage as well?
Not well, in terms of bills we will, but not in terms of constitutional amendments, I don't think. Certainly Bill McCamley has the recreational marijuana bill. This is I think the second time, if not more than that he's tried to get that through. I was surprised when we did our endorsement interviews before the campaign, before the election this year, how much support there was for that among both Republicans and Democrats. So we'll see. I think support for that is growing. Minimum wage, there will be two proposals that have been introduced so far. One would take it up to $15 an hour. I don't see that going in New Mexico. But Bill Soules has one that would be about half that much. And that one might have a chance. I don't know.
Is that something that we could see as a possible deal maker with the Democratic-controlled legislature and the governor?
I think so. In the past, the governor has shown openness to at least consider an increase in the minimum wage.
I think her position was that we want to be on par with our neighbors, and after, was it Arizona and Colorado? Right. Both raised their minimum wage. The argument that we weren't on par with our neighbors, I think, has dissolved somewhat. I don't see 15 going anywhere, but something, less than that.
All right, well, we just have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to move on to talking about something that has recently happened in the legislature, and that is some bills to address open primaries in the state. Obviously, this is the 2016 could be called the year of the outsider. So there are two bills, is that correct, willing to address the open primaries?
I'm not sure about bills, but that is one where there is a joint resolution, which would change the Constitution, and you wouldn't need the governor's approval on. As an independent, it always frustrates me every time the primary comes around and I'm not able to participate. I understand the argument that the party should control who their candidates is, and open primaries maybe allows for tinkering, allows for people to go in and put in the weakest candidate of the other party, something like that. But I don't know. In other states, I don't think that's a huge problem.
Well, if you look at what happened electorally this year, obviously the parties in their old traditional structure just simply don't work the way that they had kind of originally intended. So I think we're in uncharted territory in terms of what comes next for party politics at a high level. And this could be interesting. It'd be, as Walt mentioned earlier, independents are a growing section of the electorate, particularly among, I think, millennials, are not as party affiliated. They're more issue oriented. So yeah.
It will be interesting to see what happens with that and how the parties respond, I believe, as well. But I want to thank you both for being here. Thanks to Walt Rubel of the Las Cruces Sun News and Lauren Villagran of the Albuquerque Journal. Remember, you could always keep up with us with the latest news at krwg.org, and we would like to hear from you. What are your story ideas and topics for this program and others? You can always email us at feedback@nmsu, and keep up with us on social media. Follow us on Twitter at KRWG and like us on Facebook. I'm Anthony Moreno. Thanks for joining us for New Mexico Now.